The Vakar were the galaxy's perfect conquerors. They were not driven by malice, nor by greed, nor by any recognizable passion. Their expansion across the spiral arm was guided by a single, cold, and immutable philosophy, the objective imperative. Life, in the Vakar's view, was a resource. Civilizations were complex systems to be analyzed, dismantled, and their most efficient components integrated into the ever-expanding Vakar dominion. They saw the universe not as a collection of peoples, but as a vast, inefficient equation that they, the Vakar, were uniquely qualified to solve. Biologically, they were formidable. Towering bipedal beings with dense bone-like armor plating integrated into their gray skin, they were born for conflict. But their true strength, their ultimate weapon, was a profound and total lack of empathy. It was not a cultural trait, but a biological one. The part of their brain that, in other species, would process mirror neurons, compassion, and shared emotional states, was simply absent. They could understand fear in an enemy as a tactical variable, but they could not feel it. They could observe the bonds of family and friendship in a target species as a societal weakness to be exploited, but the concept of such attachments was utterly alien to them. This made them ruthlessly efficient. A Vakar warrior felt no hesitation, no remorse, no flicker of doubt. War was a clean, mathematical process. Planets were assets, populations were statistics, and collateral damage was a rounding error. For centuries, their advance had been unstoppable. They had dismantled the shimmering fleets of the Luminary Collective by logically targeting their power sources, ignoring the beautiful, desperate light shows of their dying crews. They had subjugated the fierce, honor-bound legions of the Cathar by exploiting their predictable adherence to ritual combat. They were the ultimate predators in a galaxy of emotional, irrational prey. When the Vakar Dominion encountered the Terran Federation, their analysis was swift and conclusive. Humanity was a chaotic, inefficient, and deeply flawed species, crippled by their greatest biological weakness: empathy. We were slaves to our emotions, our decisions constantly, clouded by irrational attachments to family, friends, and abstract concepts like freedom and hope. High Commander Varax, a veteran of 100 campaigns, a being whose personal armor was etched with the mathematical proofs of his victories, presented the analysis to the Dominion's ruling council. Species designation: human. They are a species of profound internal conflict. Their capacity for empathy makes them hesitant, their attachment to individuals makes them vulnerable, and their history is a litany of inefficient, emotion-driven wars. They are, by all logical metrics, a sub-optimal system. The Council was unanimous. Humanity was to be the next component integrated into the Dominion. The war was expected to be brief, a simple matter of applying overwhelming, logical force until the humans' chaotic emotional state inevitably collapsed into despair and submission. The Vakar fleets, vast, silent ships of dark, non-reflective metal, entered Terran space. The war began, and it was, initially, a slaughter. The sea. Vakar were right in a way. Humanity's empathy was a weakness. We mourned our losses with a grief that was, to the Vakar, a crippling waste of energy. We fought to protect strategically insignificant civilian populations, sacrificing valuable military assets for purely emotional reasons. Our soldiers hesitated. They showed mercy. They made illogical choices based on their bonds with one another. But the Vakar were also wrong. They had failed to understand that empathy was not just a weakness. It was also the source of humanity's most terrifying and unpredictable strength. On the besieged colony of New Harmony, a Vakar legion, moving with their usual flawless precision, had cornered a platoon of Terran Marines. The Marines were out of ammunition, their position overrun. The logical course of action, as calculated by the Vakar commander, was surrender or a futile, disorganized final charge. Instead, the human platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran with a shattered leg, ordered his remaining soldiers to form a shield wall around a group of terrified civilian children who had been caught in the crossfire. The Marines, knowing it was their end, stood their ground, their combat knives and empty rifles held in a last, defiant gesture. They did not surrender. They did not charge. They simply protected. They died to a man, but they bought the children. A few more precious moments of life. The Vakar commander, observing the event, logged it as a tactical anomaly. The human combat units willingly sacrificed themselves for non-combatant juveniles. An inefficient expenditure of trained assets. Their emotional attachment led to their predictable demise. What the commander could not quantify was the effect of this sacrifice. The story of the Shields of New Harmony spread like wildfire through the Terran networks. It was not a story of defeat, but a story of profound, defiant love. It did not break human morale. It forged it into something harder, something colder, something utterly unbreakable. Grief turned to rage. Fear turned to resolve. Humanity began to fight with a ferocity that defied the Vakar's neat, logical calculations. We fought not just to win, but to avenge. We fought not for territory, but for each other. Our empathy, the source of our pain, became the fuel for our fury. The war devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate. The Vakar, for all their technological superiority and logical precision, found themselves bogged down. They were winning every battle, but they were not breaking the human will to fight. They were conquering planets, but they were not conquering the people. It was a variable they had never encountered. It was a problem without a logical solution. The turning point of the war did not happen on a grand battlefield or in a strategic command center. It happened in the mud and blood of a forgotten field hospital on the besieged moon of Cygnus X-1. The hospital was a chaotic, desperate place, a microcosm of the human war effort. Medics, their faces masks of exhaustion, moved through rows of wounded soldiers, their hands working with a gentle precision that was a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the war. One of these medics was a young man named Elias Thorne. He was not a warrior. His hands, though steady, were made for healing, not for killing. He had seen more suffering than most soldiers, had held the hands of dying men and women, and had felt a piece of his own soul chip away with every loss. His empathy was both his greatest gift and his most profound curse. During a particularly brutal Vakar assault, the hospital was overrun. The fighting was fierce, a desperate, close-quarters struggle in the corridors and makeshift operating rooms. In the chaos, a Vakar warrior, a high-ranking centurion, was critically wounded, his armored form torn open by a plasma grenade. The human Marines, seeing their hated enemy vulnerable, moved in for the kill. But Elias, acting on an instinct he couldn't explain, threw himself in front of the wounded Vakar. "No!" he shouted, his voice raw. "He's a patient! This is a hospital!" The Marines stared at him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fury. "He's a butcher, Doc! He's killed hundreds of our own!" "And we are not him," Elias replied, his gaze unwavering. "We are not butchers. We are healers. Now back off and let me work." Reluctantly, the Marines withdrew, their disgust palpable. The Vakar centurion, his consciousness fading, watched the small, soft-bodied human approach. He expected a final killing blow. He expected the logical conclusion to his defeat. Instead, he saw the human produce a medical scanner, its soft blue light playing over his grievous wounds. He saw the human begin to work, skillfully and efficiently, staunching the flow of his strange, dark blood, applying biofoam to his shattered armor plating. The centurion's wounds were too severe. His life force was draining away. Elias, checking. His scanner saw the inevitable. The Vakar circulatory system was collapsing. He needed a blood transfusion, a massive one. But Vakar blood was alien. its composition unknown. Elias looked at the dying alien, at the symbol of a war that had brought so much pain and suffering. And in that moment, he saw not a monster, not an enemy, but a living being on the brink of death. He made a choice, a profoundly illogical, deeply compassionate, and ultimately galaxy-altering choice. His own blood type was O-negative, the universal donor. He didn't know if it would work. The biological incompatibility should, by all rights, kill the Vicar instantly. But it was the only chance the alien had. He hooked up a transfusion line, a crude, improvised connection between his own arm and the Vicar's circulatory system. He began to pump his own lifeblood into his enemy. "What are you doing, human?" A faint, rasping thought echoed in his mind, the Vicar's first and only attempt at communication. "I'm a doctor," Elias whispered, as his own blood, rich with 1,000,000,000 years of chaotic, emotional, and profoundly empathetic evolution, began to flow into the veins of the perfect, logical conqueror. "It's what I do." The Vicar Centurion did not die. Against all odds, his body, instead of rejecting the human blood, began to adapt. The human hemoglobin, the complex proteins, the very essence of human vitality, stabilized his collapsing systems. The Centurion, whose name was Kavrak, survived. He was taken as a prisoner of war, a prize of immense intelligence value, but as he recovered in a secure human medical facility, something strange began to happen to him. The first symptom was a dream. Kavrak had never dreamt before. The Vicar did not dream. Their minds were silent, efficient processors, even during their regenerative cycles. But now his mind was filled with chaotic, fragmented images, with feelings he had no name for. He saw the faces of the human soldiers he had killed not as statistics, but as individuals. He felt a faint, ghostly echo of their fear, their pain. He dismissed it as a side effect of the alien transfusion, a temporary neurological anomaly. Then came the second symptom. During an interrogation, a human officer showed him a recording of the Vicar's assault on New Harmony, the sacrifice of the Marine platoon. Kavrak watched the event, which he had previously analyzed as a tactically inefficient maneuver by the humans. But this time, he felt something else. A strange, tightening sensation in his chest. A wetness in his multifaceted eyes. He was feeling grief. He was feeling admiration. The human medical team, led by Dr. Anya Sharma, was baffled. Kavrak's biology was changing. The human blood had not just saved him, it had infected him. The complex neurochemicals, the hormones, the very building blocks of human empathy were being replicated within his own system. His brain was developing. New neural pathways, repurposing dormant sections to process these new alien emotions. He was developing an empathy he had never known. Kavrak, the perfect warrior, was becoming flawed. He was becoming human. The true danger, however, was not the change in Kavrak, but the potential for that change to spread. The Vicar, in their relentless pursuit of efficiency, had a standard procedure for dealing with warriors who had survived grievous, seemingly impossible injuries. They would study them, analyze their biology, and replicate any beneficial adaptations across their entire legion. They wanted to understand how Kavrak had survived, so they could make all their warriors that resilient. When Kavrak was eventually returned to his people in a prisoner exchange, the Vicar medical scientists descended upon him. They were not interested in his mind, only his body. They took samples of his blood, now a strange hybrid fluid containing both Vicar and human elements. They analyzed the new proteins, the strange neurochemicals. They saw only a remarkable biological adaptation for survival, and then, with their usual flawless efficiency, they began to synthesize it. They began to create a serum, a resilience enhancement based on Kavrak's unique blood. They began to inoculate their finest warriors, their elite legions, with the human contagion. They were trying to replicate his resilience. They were, in fact, spreading the empathy plague. The effect was not immediate. It was a slow, insidious change, a creeping infection of the Vikar's collective soul. A Vikar legion, inoculated with the new resilience enhancement, was deployed to the front lines. They were stronger, more durable. Their survival rates in battle increased by a statistically significant margin. The experiment was declared a success. But then the anomalies began. A Vikar sharpshooter, his sights trained on a human medic who was desperately trying to save a wounded soldier, hesitated. He saw not a target, but a fellow being engaged, in an act of compassion. He lowered his weapon, a flicker of doubt, of shared feeling, staying his hand. A Vikar demolition expert, about to destroy a civilian residential block, paused. He could hear the faint, muffled sounds of children crying from within. He felt a strange, protective urge, an illogical desire to shield the weak, not to destroy them. He sabotaged his own explosive charge, reporting it as a malfunction. These were isolated incidents at first, dismissed as individual malfunctions, as glitches in the system, but they began to spread. The inoculated Vikar warriors started to dream. They started to feel a strange, unsettling connection to their enemies. They began to question the objective imperative. The neat, clean mathematics of war were being complicated by the messy, unpredictable variables of emotion. High Commander Varax, observing the declining efficiency of his elite legions, was bewildered. They are hesitant. Their reaction times are slowing. They are showing a statistical increase in suboptimal target selection. They are avoiding civilian casualties, even when it is tactically advantageous to inflict them. He ordered the Whisper Priests, the Vikar's own psychological analysts, though their analysis was based on pure logic, to investigate. The Whisper Priests delved into the minds of the affected warriors. They expected to find a human-designed psychic virus, a weapon of mental disruption. They found something far more terrifying. They found empathy. High Commander, a Whisper Priest, reported, its own voice now tinged with a strange, new emotion that sounded like fear. The human biological agents, they have not just enhanced their resilience, they have altered their consciousness. They are feeling the pain of their enemies. They are understanding their motivations. The human flaw, it is contagious. The truth was out. The empathy plague was spreading, and the Vikar had no cure. How could you cure an emotion? The Vikar dominion began to unravel from the inside out. The legions infected with the empathy plague became unreliable, their warriors often refusing to fight or actively sabotaging their own missions. The plague spread, not just through the inoculation program, but through a new, unforeseen vector, compassion itself. An infected Vikar warrior, seeing a comrade fall, would feel grief. It would try to save its fallen comrade, a previously unheard-of act of inefficiency. In doing so, it would often come into contact with their blood, spreading the contagion further. The very act of caring for one another, a concept born from the plague, was now its primary method of transmission. The Vikar High Command was in a state of crisis. Their greatest weapon, their lack of empathy, was being systematically dismantled by an enemy who had turned their own compassion into a biological agent. They tried to quarantine the infected legions, but it was too late. The plague had already spread to their command structure, to their medical corps, even to some of the Whisper Priests themselves. The war ground to a halt. Vikar fleets would arrive in a system, prepare to engage, and then simply stop. Their commanders, now afflicted with the terrible burden of empathy, could not bring themselves to give the order to fire on civilian populations. They could not bring themselves to sacrifice their own troops for a purely logical objective. Humanity, observing this strange, silent collapse, was as bewildered as the Vakar. Our fleets, prepared for a final, desperate defense of the soul system, found themselves facing an enemy that had simply lost the will to fight. Dr. Anya Sharma and her team of xenobiologists finally pieced together the puzzle. They analyzed the data from the captured Vakar, from the reports of their strange, hesitant behavior. They traced it all back to a single, illogical act of compassion in a forgotten field hospital on Cygnus X-1. "Elias Thorne," Anya whispered, her voice filled with a profound sense of awe. "He didn't just save one life. He ended a war. He didn't fight them with weapons. He infected them with humanity." The Vakar Dominion did not fall in a blaze of glory. It simply changed. The objective imperative, the cold, logical philosophy that had guided them for millennia, was replaced by a new, confusing, and often painful search for meaning. The Vakar, now a species grappling with the full spectrum of emotion, turned inward. They began to experience art, music, philosophy. They began to build, not just to conquer. They began to feel, and in doing so, they began to truly live. The transition was not easy. A species that had never known grief or love or doubt was suddenly overwhelmed by them. Their society was in turmoil. But it was a turmoil of growth, not of destruction. Elias Thorne, the humble medic, was brought before the new Vakar leadership. They were not the cold, logical conquerors of before. They were a council of confused, struggling, but ultimately hopeful beings. Kavrak, the first of the infected, was now their leader. His face, once a mask of cold indifference, was now etched with the lines of 1,000 new emotions. "Human," Kavrak said, his voice now a deep, resonant baritone, filled with a strange, new warmth. "You have defeated us, but you have not destroyed us. You have given us a gift, a terrible, painful, and beautiful gift. You have taught us how to feel." Elias, who had lived with the weight of his decision for years, felt a profound sense of relief, of absolution. "I just did my job," he said quietly. "I just tried to heal." The war was over. Humanity had won, but it was a victory unlike any other in the history of the galaxy. It was a victory achieved not through force of arms, but through force of heart. It was a victory that had not destroyed an enemy, but had transformed them. Part 8. The Legacy of a Single Act In. The aftermath, the galaxy tried to understand what had happened. Humanity, the chaotic, emotional, and deeply flawed species, had defeated the perfect, logical conquerors. They had done so not with superior technology, but with a unique and now legendary biological weapon: empathy. The story of Elias Thorne, the medic who had given his blood to his enemy, became a legend, a cautionary tale for those who believed that logic alone could conquer the universe. It was a story of how a single, illogical act of compassion in the right place, at the right time, could change the course of history. The Vakar, now known as the Vakar Ascended, became a new, powerful force for peace in the galaxy. Their understanding of both logic and emotion made them uniquely suited to be diplomats, mediators, and guardians of the fragile balance between the diverse peoples of the cosmos. Humanity, in its messy, beautiful, and often contradictory way, had once again proven that its greatest perceived weaknesses were, in fact, its most profound strengths. Our capacity for empathy, for compassion, for seeing a fellow living being even in the face of our most hated enemy, was not a flaw. It was our soul. And it was a soul that had, in the end, proven to be the most powerful, most contagious, and most transformative force the galaxy had ever known. The empathy plague had not been a weapon of destruction, but a vaccine of the heart, curing a galaxy of its cold, logical indifference.